Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to connect on this topic beyond age, race and gender, and talk about diversity in clinical trials from a slightly, different angle, with the focus on the translations. And from my perspective, since I come from community oncology in the United States, I would like to be able to focus on that area of the community practices which are participating in the research and how we are also contributing to that improved diversity in clinical trials. Let me introduce myself. I am Director of Research Operations in the Regulatory Affairs for US Oncology Research. I had the pleasure working with this company for over 5 years, but I have a quite extensive experience working in the life sciences industry in support of clinical research for quite a while. So as I mentioned today, we will be talking today about a couple of aspects of the factors which can we work on increase diversity in clinical trials. And we know that we need to look beyond gender, race, and age, because that is very focused and very discussed in clinical trials during the settings or even in the literature. But I would like to be able to focus on the some barriers for participation in minority ethnic populations. We will touch base on the impact of diversity on clinical research and how translations and community oncology can play a part in overcoming the barriers. It is well-known fact in our industry that regulatory approvals for majority of the medicines which are available today are based on the clinical research data generated from overwhelmingly white, non-Hispanic, and until the 90s, male participants. For the most part, current medical therapies, as well as most of those which are currently in development, have been tested inadequately or not at all in women, children, older adults, individuals with multiple chronic conditions, low-income individuals, and racially and ethnically diverse populations. While the industry made a significant progress over the last 27 years in closing the gender diversity gap since the passage of the NIH Revitalization Act in 1993, that situation is still not true for all disease types, even today, and it's not proportionately addressed, even gender proportionately addressed in this population. I'm very happy that this month the FDA finalized the guidance addressing the enhancing the diversity of clinical trials populations, and with the focus on eligibility criteria, enrollment practices, and the trial design guidance for the industry. And then that regulation, FDA stated that over the past few decades, FDA promoted enrollment practices that would lead to clinical trials that better reflect the population most likely to actually use the drug if the drug is approved, and primarily through broadening eligibility criteria. Despite these efforts, challenges to participation in clinical trials remain, and certain groups continue to be underrepresented in many clinical trials. This guidance recommends approaches that sponsors of clinical trials intended to support a new drug application or biologics license application can take to increase enrollment of underrepresented populations in their clinical trials. This guidance considers both demographic characteristics of the study populations, such as sex, race, ethnicity, age, location of residency, and non-demographic characteristics of populations, such as patients with organ dysfunction, comorbid conditions, disabilities, those at the extremes of the weight range, and populations with diseases or conditions with low prevalence. FDA also recommends inclusion of racial and ethnic minorities in clinical trials and the analysis of clinical trial data by race and ethnicity. Differences in response to medical products, such as pharmacokinetics, efficacy, or safety, have been observed in racially and ethnically distinct groups in US population. These differences may be attributable to intrinsic factors such as genetics, metabolism, elimination, or extrinsic factors, diet, environmental exposure, or sociocultural issues, or interactions between these factors. Analyzing data on race and ethnicity may assist in identifying population-specific signals. Therefore, FDA recommends that for drugs and biologics, sponsors include a plan for inclusion of clinically relevant populations no later than the end of the phase 2 meeting. Growth of our understanding of the last decades of human genetics and the importance of pharmacogenomics and pharmacogenetics for proper administration of medicines based on individual differences is becoming a norm. However, understanding prevalence of mutations in specific ethnic or racial groups that will determine response to targeted therapies is critical for their success. For example, EGFR mutations occur in 30 to 40% of non-small cell lung cancer in Asian populations, compared to only 10 to 15% in Western populations. While Asians represent 5.6% of total US population, they have less than 2% share of clinical trial participants. So the major barriers to participation of racially and ethnically underrepresented patients in clinical trials include multiple factors. It starts with lack of trust. It generates lack of trust, always generates fear. The uncertainty of the impacts of social determinants of health, lack of information about the clinical trials, logistic constraints associated with participation, such as time, out-of-pocket expenses as other resource constraints, and lack of comfort with overall clinical trial process. All of that is not allowing behavioral change readiness in this population to be able to shift towards the greater participation in the trials. In addition, there is a shortage of suitably qualified investigators in underrepresented communities and clinics, and a lack of infrastructure and resources needed to perform clinical trials in the underrepresented communities and populations. And efforts for improving both of those are foundational to changing the landscape of clinical trials. We're all aware of well-established issues with trust in clinical research, and despite the effort over several decades, we still have that complex challenge to overcome, as I addressed on the previous slide. However, I want to also identify a few more prosaic, tactical, and self-imposed issues that can be tackled today. Most of them are driven by budget constraints for clinical trials. In our experience, some sponsors and CROs have SOPs today supporting translation of informed consent only if site expects to enroll 3 subjects of the same language, or if they expect at least those 3 participants with the similar consent. Translation costs are a risk factor for a trial budget because it can be unpredictable. Some of the languages are much more expensive to translate. Some study teams require use of one large vendor that can result in delays in translation and loss of patients, particularly in oncology, to routine care. Our patients cannot wait on negotiations and a two-week turnaround time. Physicians will shift them to routine care to make sure they are not delaying their treatment. And we lost patients because of that in our experience. Some study teams do not have translated patient-reported outcome materials planned in their study design and allow only English-speaking individuals. That is also due to the cost factor, because all the licenses for the translated questionnaires sometimes as well, they cost, and if this is the custom design payroll, that is also a significant factor. Opening trials outside academic centers is also a barrier, because it's a perception that oncology is less qualified, but again, more community focused clinical trials. That means the sponsors will have to open more sites, which can commit to a smaller enrollment target, but they will have a larger footprint. However, community oncology, it's commonly understood as of today that community oncology is a key for the diversity. FDA guidance states some patients may be unable to participate without reasonable accommodations, such as patients with physical or mental disabilities, non-English speakers, patients who work and require evening or weekend hours, and some older adult patients with limited access to transportation. Unnecessary exclusion of such participants may lead to a failure to discover important safety information about use of the investigational drug in patients who will take the drug after approval. So to support ethnic diversity, focus on making clinical trials available at the local point of residence is critical. Community oncology setting provides access to patients close to home, where they can retain support of their family and local community, instead of being forced to disrupt their lives and travel hundreds of miles to have access to latest treatments. Lack of trust in clinical research is a known barrier for participation in African American and Hispanic communities in the United States. Bad history cannot be easily forgotten. However, engagement and long-term local relationships with diverse doctors and research teams can support better engagement with those populations. And we have a history of our own experience to prove that that is a true fact. I want to present you the organization for which I work. It's a US Oncology Research. And our organization represents over 60 research sites with 165 physical locations. We do have 21 phase 1 sites and support over 900 investigators. We have contributed to over 100 FDA approvals. At this time, we enrolled over 84,000 subjects in our network, conducted over 1,500 clinical trials, and we have participating in phase 1 through phase 4 research. We support around 400 studies managed at any given time. There are multiple oncology specialties, and the committees which our network proudly supports. We employ some leading physicians in the oncology field in the United States and in the world. And we bringing patients the latest treatment options close to home through the deep clinical expertise, robust technology assets which we employ, and unique operational approaches. We operate as a site management organization, and we facilitate and coordinate performance of the clinical trials for all sites which participate on this study through US Oncology Research. So we provide administrative services for trial conduct, allowing the site focus on screening and enrolling and treating patients. And we will take care of everything else. We negotiate one budget for the whole network. It's a one contract. It's a one IRB approval. It's all the regulatory and critical documents are housed in our regulatory e-binder and handled centrally. We do have the central IP distribution center, and we are operating using one clinical trial management system, which handles all our transactions and captures the information. When we're talking about the disproportionate rate of participation of different groups in research, if we look at the ethnic picture in the United States, because of the changing demographics, it's expected that by 2045, more than 50% of the population will be other in the United States than non-Hispanic white. However, participation in overall clinical trials with the data from 2019 is still disproportionate, even we had some shifts in certain populations. So as of 2019, we have 9% of African Americans participating, which is less than half of the total population. 9% of Asian, but that percentage is much lower on the oncology trials. We have 8% Hispanic and 72% white. These rates, as I mentioned, are even more overall, and they are more skewed in oncology. So if you look at the oncology, you will see that the percent of cancer diagnosis for Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino origin is 15 and 13% accordingly. But for the clinical research participation is anywhere between 4 to 6% for African Americans and 3 to 6% for Hispanic or Latino origin. However, if you look at the demographic numbers for US oncology research, we have 8% African Americans and 9% Hispanic participating. So for the Hispanic or Latino origin participants, we're almost doubling the our US rates. So to support diversity, FDA guidelines recommending to consider providing trial resources and documents in multiple languages and multilingual research staff and or interpreters in order to encourage the participation and retention of individuals with limited English comprehension. To support that, US Oncology Network, Central IRB, which we use for our trials, requires for all trials informed consent form and patient study materials to be translated and be available in Spanish. For all trials, everything is translated to Spanish and available at the opening of the study. We have implemented short form consent and have it currently available in 22 languages. However, our IRB requires, because we are doing high-risk trials in oncology, our IRB requires participants consented on a short form to be reconsented with fully translated version of their ICF prior to administration of the investigational product. And thus, quick translation approval from the sponsor and allowance for us to use our vendor we consider is imperative for success of capturing those subjects. We also recently implemented e-consent, and that is also enabling our sites to offer that technology to support the video chat consent process in which interpreter can be conferenced in remotely. We have implemented certain points of the operational efficiency, and one of it is using our established vendor. USOR has a multi-year established relationship with Berg Translations as USON Central IRB preferred vendor. Just not to get you confused, the US Oncology Network IRB is overseeing US oncology research trials as well as the other trials from other groups. We have established SOP outlining timelines and processes for prioritization and expediting requests. US Oncology Research is using our own ICF templates, and we draft consents for all study instead of just using sponsor or CRO template. That allowed us to increase the quality of the consent and provide ability to utilize the standard ICF template language, which is translated previously, is being tracked by Berg and applied to all consents without the need to retranslate the same language all over and again, thus reducing cost and decreasing the translation time. I just want to also point out that we did not experience significant negative impact from COVID-19 on enrollment of patients for clinical trials in the US Oncology network. Our community oncology practices remained open for operations and for clinical research. There were very significant changes to the operational model, how the treatment is attributed, a lot of measures have been implemented as a part of the US Oncology Network practices. But we are currently on track to enroll more participants this calendar year versus the previous calendar year. Even though we are not participating in actual COVID-19 trials, we are maintaining the research on the other trials. And also, we have retained the same level of enrollment of participants using translated informed consent as the previous year data. So we have run approximately about 3% of participants last year and were Spanish, and those who required Spanish translated consent. The demographic slide, which I showed you previously, it had Hispanic origin, but not necessarily consent, which was needed for that population. So we captured that extra 3% with ability to provide translated materials, if you will add up the math. And as of those 3 months of the run of this year, we are hitting exactly the same percentage, mostly in our translated consented patient in Spanish, and we're retaining still very low percentage of the non-Hispanic patients. It's literally a handful. This will conclude my presentation. Thank you so much. I have listed some references I used in my presentation. My apologies, there is no Q&A from me. This is the recorded presentation. Thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.